2, 1. OG is going to win very simply by running two huge sets of claims. The first one is going to be why this is principally justified in the comparative, and then secondly, a bunch of specific mechanisms as to why we think this reaches more accountability or better dealing with crime on a local specialized level. Cool, but let's start with the definitions, right? What do you think police commissioners are? Look, obviously it's a senior rank of a policeman, genuinely like monitoring the police budget or holding policemen to account or deciding where we're going to allocate certain like police units are all the things that genuinely do fall under the job description of a commissioner. What is relevant about the local level? Look, we say it's either going to be like on a city level or in the bigger cities that have distinct neighborhoods with like different demographic or obviously different crime rates, etc. We can generally see like the neighborhood being quite distinctly different, or geographically just big cities. We would be completely fine with it being on a neighborhood level too, and we would all probably want to prioritize maximize that to the biggest extent. What is a comparative then? We say that in the status quo, what opposition has to defend is that you don't actually have like national elections. So you have like a policeman, so I'm going to vote for like nationally for my like police god that's going to redistribute all the police units in my country, right? Obviously, very often in like most states, in like the liberal democracies, which I would also tend to know, this is probably where this debate actually takes place, to the ability that people can actually vote, and there's an incentive to like trickle down the voting to a local level. I would presume there's also voting on a national level, but it's very often by proxy, right? So it's like high police duties are very often appointed by like ministers of internal affairs or people that they're close to, who they actually have access to, like police or in the police department, that they are then appointed like by the parliament or whatever the equivalent would be in different countries. The point of this is to say that comparative is on opposition. You have it by proxy, by like voting for someone in the parliament, then appointing a minister, and the minister having his like internal meddling is going to appoint certain police commissioners. I don't think it's like direct voting. In the comparative is we have actual direct people local voting is status quo. Sometimes the comparative can also be is that police commissioners or higher like police hierarchies are also chosen by like policemen in and of itself. In some countries, that is the comparative. I think we'd also rather have people take this accountability than policemen themselves. I'm also going to run that. Cool. Why do you think this is principally justified then? Look, obviously, let's go to this very quickly. We know all the state power principles, right? It's one of the things, like the state basically having the power over the people and controlling people's lives, specifically with the laws. It can oppress people with police and the state. Look, obviously, yes, go on.
Aren't in most cases police commissioners, police departments are part of municipalities and therefore elected or appointed by mayors and people of the municipality? That's how it works in the vast majority of the world.
I genuinely get it. I think it can be in a lot of different ways, but even if I have to run the comparative of like I'm voting for my local politician and him appointing a police commissioner, I'm still gonna win. So thank you. Cool. Look, I think the main way to ensure agency of individuals is to allow them to maximize, to the best of their ability, recourse towards the state or the systems used to oppress them. People who live in certain areas know which streets to avoid, right? They see and experience crimes, etc. I think they have bigger access to their own fears, demands, and wishes than the state does, or the Minister of Internal Affairs, or like specifically the policemen who are genuinely being in the police and having a completely different lived experience of someone who is not protected, but they are because they have a gun and they have some sort of authority, or even the local, whatever Gil's POI was, your local like mayor who probably has a bunch of other shit to take care of, such as like having to invest in like your like infrastructure, having to invest in jobs, taxes, etc. Right? So I think genuinely people dealing with the fears, walking the streets, seeing what people do, or they themselves experiencing some type of abuse, are probably the ones that have access to it the best way. Right? Look, I think by allowing citizens to express their wishes and have a local specific body, so not the mayor, that is designed to represent people local and be responsible to them in terms of policing, we think this is a justified act because police being one of the strongest mechanisms the state can hold against you. We think this is a justified act regardless of the outcomes in this debate. Why? Because I think no one in this round can contest two things. One, that individuals have the best access to their own lived experiences, knowing how and they want to control things. But secondly, that to maximize agency of an individual means for them to have the most control over their lived experiences. Meaning they need to be allowed to have direct control over police that impact their lives and safety. What is the way? Opposition can say that you cannot maximize agency to this extent because people will be like irrational or screw up practically. I think this is still fine because this is a speculative, tangible clash in this round. Meaning the issue on opposition is they presume people are going to fuck up and then minimize the recourse, which at the point where you do not have epistemic access to people is an unjustified act in and of itself, based on a speculative and not on a normative claim. And this argument is logically prior to all the other claims you're going to hear at the point where it's not contingent on any of the tangible clashes in the round. What is the comparative? I think when proxy, it's minimized and not direct, right? I think people vote for their representatives on other issue, which is a huge mix of everything, as already respond to Gil in terms that you're going to vote for your mayor, specifically for like your schools for kids, healthcare, education, a bunch of other things. But also secondly, people do not have direct oversight about how these people are appointed, either it's police, national, or a mayor level, right? What their plans are, who they are specifically as a people, why they have been promoting, meaning the middleman that always exists in opposition in whatever country in the world that we're debating in is always overshadowed, meaning no direct control. Why is it now easier to hold the police accountable? One, commissioners now have the incentive to appease to people due to their campaigns, right? This means that directly, if the police is doing something wrong, obviously there is an easier way to call it out, specifically because their job and their like identity and everything that people know is that they are the ones that are in charge of safety, not in charge of a bunch of different things as a mayor is. Secondly, people who are competing in the next elections have an incentive to like dig up dirt on the current commissioner, right? Meaning they're going to actively search for and call out mistakes. We're going to appeal to more demographics, even if it's like minorities who are being oppressed, like from the commission, so they can dig out to the commissioner currently power because there's an incentive too, because they want to have the prestige, they want to have this position. So I mean, there's an active opposition incentive now than it is in the status quo, where you can't do that. You just hope they're going to be chosen and based on your stats, age, etc. Before I go on, POI proposing opposition.
Would you also have directly elected heads of education systems, of infrastructure systems, of all the things, of hospitals?
Yes, Gail, I would. I think based on my principle, I stand behind this, and I can also, well, I'm also going to win on it, so cool. Lastly, since this is now an election, the locals have actual power. This means they will be comparatively more interested in what's happening in their local community, right? Because very often you just don't think that either things are going to be taken into account, or specifically that, you know, they're not necessarily people care about this because people, you're going to think that other people around you sort of care about, you know, the education, how much money they have, etc. So very often if you like see like the specific neighborhood which has like a lot of like drunk dudes constantly hitting on women, or if you can see that someone's genuinely, like very often people are being hit there, or like women abused, but people necessarily don't import. And now you genuinely feel like there's something that's going to be relevant, taken into account, because there's someone whose direct like job and their own identity is tied to genuinely fucking listening to you and taking into account whatever the policeman does, right? So even if they don't like research themselves, I also think that the local media has an incentive to dig up mistakes for them, since now there's a larger audience for that kind of content, specifically when it's concentrated on people's safety, which is very often something that's very relevant and proximate to humans. What are the impacts of this? One, obviously people have a greater recourse towards the state. Secondly, police commissioners have to be more careful. In the status quo, they can often get like complacency. It's just harder to lose your job. This leads to better policing and less scandals. And I think also that meaning less people get shot on the fucking street unnecessarily because more crime is being like has oversight. And lastly, the police officer in the field are more awake than them being fucking up, could lead to them being fired directly because they're also now accountable to this person, is accountable to people. I think they're going to be more careful to not fuck up. For all these reasons, please vote opening government.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their speech. Before you proceed to
Two, one, go. Opening government is going to lose this debate because they do not fulfill their own principle. We're going to show why we actually have better mechanisms to get proper accountability on the ground, and a better way for people to be represented, while at the same time also showing why structural reform that benefits particularly marginalized communities is significantly more likely on our side in the status quo, at the point at which police commissioners are not elected. In order to do this, I will do a few things. First, I will talk a little bit about how people vote, specifically how that translates into how they behave in elections, specifically for police commissioners, and how that may differ from mayors that are the more directly accountable. And then I will also go a little bit more deeper into what actually shifts at the point at which you have two different electoral figures with a contradicting mandate that ultimately means that you're going to entrench more conservative, more right-wing approaches to policing, and thereby binding the hands of mayors, preventing the kind of political accountability and actual change that they often get elected to do. Now, first things first. Obviously the counterfactual to their case is not voting in a national politician and it trickles down to the lowest level, right? We have more directly accountable people. People vote for their mayors, and their mayors are directly held to account on the way that life feels on the ground there. This, of course, also has economic issues, but very strongly also safety is an issue that people care about and they expect from their mayors change. Note at the point at which, of course, you have a police commissioner being in a different election, having a different person that more directly is appropriate for the police. We have some of the electoral mandate that is very specific, that where the mayor probably loses a lot of purview and oversight and ability to change things. We think this is bad. Now, note, we do not believe that, first of all, people vote purely on rational issues, right? People approach elections very differently, but largely here's a small list of things they consider. One is just genuinely who seems more appealing to me, who intuitively is made for this role and is supposed to fill it, right? Secondly, it's also about where do I feel safer, where do I feel good, who is more likely to give me that, who's going to comfort me. And the third of all is even with such basic things as who seems more attractive or relatable on the basis of their perception and their appearance and the way they get to frame themselves. And this ultimately coagulates, in addition to, of course, caring about policies, into my decision mandate. Now, how does this translate to specifically police commissioners? Note that we live in a world where we have all been exposed to decades and decades of explicit framing of what we are supposed to expect from police, right? We think of tough on crime, hard-nosed cops that get law and order done on the ground, right? This is specifically what we expect from police officers, and by portraying themselves as we see in the status quo for district attorneys in the United States and judges, etc., that they portray themselves very strongly as tough on crime, willing to get the things done. They basically copycat imagery from CSI Miami, and thereby hit the gut of the voters pretty well in terms of, okay, this seems to be a proper police commissioner that I can trust. Frank, I'll take you later. So ultimately, there we already have a framing where our entire media landscape and the way we have been taught to think about police already gears us towards prioritizing more strong, tough on crime kind of approaches by police commissioners, etc. Right? Note that this also then starts trickling down pretty hard, especially in local elections where we see usually less participation. This also means that we have, of course, to think about who is more likely to vote in local elections rather than in national elections, and how that is going to shape these outcomes too. Note that in particular, when we take a look at cities and municipalities, there's still huge inequality and structural differences in terms of who gets to vote and who gets to take time off work, who gets to wait for hours in line potentially, and who might have shorter lines because they live in a more affluent neighborhood, right? These are structural factors that are going to go into how the police commissioner is going to be elected. Note that the structural ability to vote depends on, first of all, leisure time, but it also depends on good infrastructural access. So therefore, you have a massive kind of a bigger barrier usually for more marginalized communities to attack. It's largely easier for richer, whiter suburbs to go vote. But in particular, this is something they are significantly more easily mobilized, and also it's structurally geared towards somewhat older people that have stronger internalized than the just rhythm and ritual of going to elections again and again. And particularly if they're in retirement, they don't face the kind of opportunity costs of having to sacrifice a day of work, which many of people in America, for instance, can't fucking afford, right? This is something that also makes these people way more likely to turn out. Note that also just simply the more elections you have every year, the more you also, I'll take you at six, don't worry, that's 1 minute left. It's specifically, it's also something that when you have more and more elections, this makes people tired of elections. They're less willing to make up that sacrifice again and again, and particularly if they're more vulnerable and are not as strongly habitualized to go voting. Notice that in local elections, it often is something where it's difficult to whip people up to actually go and make that cost. It's specifically national elections is why we spend so much time in social movements pouring in resources in order to turn people out to vote and represent their interest in national elections, where the stakes seem higher and bigger, and people are more willing to vote for candidates, and also in mayoral elections that have bigger ideas and are more transformative for the city, which means that these mayors don't have to as strongly go into law and order, etc. But ultimately, we have a stronger shift in these areas towards richer, more white and more conservative electorates to vote in the first place, particularly in local elections. Moving on, Leiden.
On what issues do you usually vote in your municipality or your national elections?
We say it depends hugely. There's tons of different ways that they can engage there, right? Law and order sometimes pops up, but often it's specifically about getting them jobs on the ground. It is about providing good infrastructure, about public transport, etc. And the public safety is also one measure. Note that they don't have to go as hard-nosed as police commissioners, because that's not specifically what they're in for only. Now, what happens at the point at which you have the structurally likely incentive where you have a more liberal, more left-wing mayor because people vote on different different areas, and social justice things are very, what do you call it, popular for mayors and larger politicians, at least on the more left spectrum. And you have a right-wing commissioner. The right-wing commissioner, because it can leverage more people, etc., will have a direct mandate to block any real forms of reform. Right? This is likely to be true on the basis of what they got voted in for and what people expect from police officers. So ultimately, what you're likely to end up with is a significantly more right-wing and more conservative policing policy than with the mayor. In the status quo, if the police commissioner is behaving in a if the police does scandals, the mayor is under huge amounts of pressure to get rid of that commissioner, and in the status quo they can fire these, and they can appoint a new one, and they can appoint new ones until the electorate and until the people feel safer on the ground. Note this is some significantly different from what they offer us. Proud to stand in opposition.
I'd like to thank the previous.
Two, one. I have to do something that I did in the quarters from opening government, because this happens every single fucking time. Olha had a principle that was weighed in a way where it outweighs everything else in the round. To the extent that knowing this debate can definitively predict how people will vote, meaning because we don't have access to the preferences, etc. People for a lot of different reasons, everything with that. Then what we can always do is say that giving them more choices and more preferences so they can express themselves better gives them bigger recourse over the state. And that should be the main thing of this debate, because that's the only thing anyone in this debate can guarantee will actually happen. No one engaged with it, probably DLO won't, probably CO won't, and then please don't forget about it when it comes to your notes. Great. Then I'm going to focus on the practice for the rest of my speech because I can. Look, a couple of things are going to happen. Rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, why does this allow people, this motion, to express their preferences better? This is in a practical way, right? What do I mean by this? Because when you're voting, national elections, local elections, mayor, president, doesn't matter. The way you're voting is polluted. Why? Because in 99% of the countries, you have one vote that you can spend. What does this mean? This means that when you're voting, you have a list of preferences of what your issues are, and you're going to sort them from most important to least important. This means that if you have, but since probably no party, no politician is going to be 100% of a match with you, this means that you're necessarily going to have to sacrifice some of your preferences, or even better, you'll never even think about them because you're focused on things that matter to you the most. This means that on the mayor comparative, when you're voting for a mayor, that mayor is tied to a politician that's tied to a political party, right? You're going to vote based on your ideology. You're going to vote because you don't want to support a party that's not your left wing or right wing, right? But here's the problem. You're also going to vote only, but you're not going to vote based on policing. Usually you're going to vote on like education, you're going to vote about everything else that the mayor does, because there are a lot of different things. This means that if you disagree with him on one issue but not on the other, you're going to get fucked over, not going to express your preferences good. This means that your quality of life drops because you're going to get a police commissioner run in a way that doesn't fit your suit you, because you're forced to vote between how harsh do you want this guy to be on crime and how expensive do I want my education to be. On the comparative of police commissioners, these people are not going to be politicians. These people are going to be someone that people that work in the police force are now competing to say, I'm going to be the police commissioner that have that kind of experience. This means that they're not going to be tied to a national ideology, not going to be competing with political parties usually, which means that you can take a more specific way here. You can come in and say, oh, this is the way this guy wants to act. Let's see what he'll do at that point. Not to mention that mayors have to make compromises in the assembly, meaning that when it comes to the issue, it's going to be life or death for you, how your policing is going to be run in your municipality. You might get fucked over because that mayor has to make a concession to an opposing party. This commissioner can be a lot better for you. Great. This means that from outside the house, people are better expressing their preferences and getting their city run in the way that they want it. Now, there are two things coming out from opening opposition. First, they say, oh, but people only vote harsh and crime and they will only vote right wing. I don't think this is true. But if I have to buy the bullet and say that even if we still win by the principle, right? But let's say why I don't think they will vote that. Firstly, I think that since this is as localized as possible, right, in big cities with distinct neighborhoods, as Ola said, you'll probably have different smaller elections. This means that in most neighborhoods, you're not going to have the other, because minorities and majorities are concentrated in enclaves, you're not going to have the kind of basically voting turnout and structure that you have for the whole nation. This means that what might be the minority in the country very likely could be the majority in that same municipality, right? Meaning that they're more likely to get a police commissioner is going to be better for them and is going to be a less racist, etc., because that's going to be the main issue that they vote on. But secondly, as even OO says, look, turnout is not going to be that great, right? Because people don't care that much of election. Sure. If people don't turn out, I'll take that as they don't care, they're neutral. Fine. But what does this mean? This means that the people that do turn out are going to be the people that care the most. What kind of people are these going to be? Yeah, we're going to have a race that comes in and say, oh, like we need to have some kind of safe policing. But more importantly, they're going to be the people that are afraid of the police currently. They know what kind of corruption scandals are inside of that. They're going to be the ones that are more likely to come out and vote. Meaning that the voting turnout is going to be greater for people who are afraid that the police will shoot them down. They're more likely to go for a police commissioner. It's going to push for reform, allow for reform, and ensure that they're going to be less harsh on crime to that extent, right? Because you're voting for, when you're voting for police officers in your municipality, you know that they are ordered to shoot on sight if they have a doubt, you know that that could be you and that something could go wrong. You're more likely to vote on the level that, hey, this person will act in this way. And also, lastly, I think especially in the 21st centuries, people aren't that stupid. People aren't just going to be, yes, justice, let's punish these people, right? That's not going to be the only thing that's going to happen. I think to say at that point, you can just say, oh, but then our whole national elections don't even make any sense because people aren't expressing their preferences anyways. They just want to see justice. You have a lot of people voting for prison reform, a lot of people voting for more rehabilitation to defund the police, right? If that's the case, if that's the political movement that's starting, I don't see a reason why to believe that all the people are going to be, justice, that's so good. Before I go on, closing opposition, do you have a point? No? Oh.
Right. Could you please explain to me why my interests are better expressed just because I fill a bubble every 4 years on a sheet of paper?
Because you fill a bubble on a sheet of paper and that makes someone else in power, and that person decides what happens in your life because they choose which police officer is going to be in your neighborhood and how are those laws going to be followed. If you do it for a mayor, you're not sure what they're going to do on policing, if that's going to be agreed with what you do on education. Great. Let's do another point of preemptive, because people like to run corruption in here. Let's say why corruption is better on our side or why we have less of them. I think Ola gave you a lot of mechanism of accountability that you get, right? You're going to care more about what's happening with the police in your local area, why you're more likely to vote, you're more likely for the media to pick it up because they have the incentive to bring you stories. But here's the thing. In the status quo in a lot of countries, especially not the most Western liberal ones, but just ones that have a democracy like Croatia, but are kind of shit anyways, those countries are going to have a big problems with corruption, like organized crime, etc., buying of police commissions. Here's the problem here. This is a lot, since going against corruption is always going to be an effective campaigning policy in the way to win your voters. There's a lot of police commissioners that now don't rely on someone else setting them there, but rely on the people electing them directly, are going to campaign on the idea of anti-corruption. They're going to come in and say, I'm not going to be bought up by this organized drug lord, etc. Why is this important then? Because for a drug lord, it's a lot harder to buy off a single police commissioner set there by the mayor than to fix a whole fucking election to ensure that this person gets in power. Because now you have direct incentives to call this guy out. If you call out a mayor, sure, that's 1 in 10 issues in that elections that he might or might not be held accountable here. But for a police commissioner, this is the only thing he does. And if he's called out for corruption, you're going to have a lot of competitors coming in and saying, you are now fucked, you are going to lose your election, vote opening government.
Three, two, one. Panel, I'm going to meet the burden that Petar throws at us and weigh the principle that they claim for us, because notice that their principle doesn't actually say what they think it says, because their principle boils down to people can have their preferences filled, meaning that their principle doesn't boil down to whether or not people fill the bubble, but whether people get their preferences filled better. This is a critical distinction, which then means that under Calix's framework that he explains to you, if we are on our side likelier to get better results for the people, meaning their preferences are likely to be be filled better, meaning that we better fulfill the government principle of where do people have the two things that opening government tells us people's preferences are. One, accountability, two, security. These are the two things that people fill these ballots out according to opening government, meaning if I show to you that we get those better on our side, then regardless of whether people get to fill their preferences, if their preferences are filled better, then we win on opening government's metric. Let's begin. First of all, Calix explains to you that we get more accountability on our side of the house because mayors have a significantly stronger incentive to actually create accountability. The reason for this is twofold. One, they are less expected to present themselves as tough on crime than police commissioners because there are fewer societal expectations of them to cut through red tape. There are fewer societal expectations of them of catching the criminal, and there are fewer societal expectations of them and creations of our mind where police officers are just the physical extension of the government's physical force arm, right? The mayor, on the other hand, is someone that we generally speaking consider as someone who is supposed to be responsible, meaning that they're a civil servant whose primary duty is to ensure that the police acts in the way they're supposed to be, right? This is why they're structurally a check and balance on one another, where the division of the forces of these kinds of forces is critically important. At the point at which we're cutting this division short, accountability actually becomes less likely to occur on site opening government, specifically because people are less likely to vote on that accountability measure. Why? One, because the people who care most about accountability are generally speaking the people who are currently not able to hold the police accountable the most. These are generally speaking people who are less likely to have access to money. These are generally speaking people who are likely to be from poorer neighborhoods. These are generally speaking people from racial minorities. Why is that true? Because the police generally feels more able to abuse their power in these instances. Why do they feel more capable of doing this? One, because they're less likely to face immediate legal backlash because the people they're policing in this way don't have the fiscal ability to actually go get a lawyer, actually go and sue them. They also usually have less political capital in society, thereby less of a voice, thereby less ability to actually go to the news, go to the media and criticize the police for this, meaning that there are structural incentives baked into into structurally racist societies that enable the police to be more criminal, to act less accountable towards minority groups. Notice that Calix then explains to you why these minority groups, where accountability is the most important metric, because accountability for rich white people isn't as important structurally speaking for those reasons. At that point, those people, as Calix explains to you, are the least able to vote. Why? Calix explains to you because they generally speaking are less able to take time off work to vote because there's generally less likely to have voting areas conveniently placed for them, and because there are incentives to keep them from voting for exactly the kinds of reasons that we've already outlined, because societies are structurally racist and disenfranchise these kinds of groups intentionally. At that point, the accountability metric is unclear to me why that gets better filled on opening government side, given that it's less likely that the people that need accountability and would prioritize this would even be able to ask for this, meaning their preferences are expressed less well. Let's talk about then security. What kind of security are we likely to get? Well, we're likely to get the kind of security that makes those people most able to vote for this individual instance, because notice that Calix already frames to you why every additional vote means you need more capital, means you need more time, you have less ability for people to express their preferences as opening government wants, meaning that under that framework then, we also get the kind of security that structurally entrenches the feeling of safety of rich, powerful white people in the West, or whoever is, the strongest class in society, that then gets to structurally entrench their power. Before I continue, opening wants to disagree.
It's not about fulfilling the preferences, but allowing people to express them by voting in the first place, which stands regardless of the outcome. But also note, most countries have an incentive to allow people to vote on Sunday or online voting. Why the fuck would
don't care if you get to fill your bubble on a piece of paper and get your voice heard, because if you don't win, then you get your preference not filled at all according to that. And given that then the consequence of your filling the bubble is actually zero, and your preference is not expressed at all, and you're less likely to win, then it's unclear to us why that's true. Even countries like Germany that do put elections on Sunday also have structural measures in place to ensure that Turkish minority areas are less able to vote. The The reason for that is because we want to police them in this way, because of the structural racism built into our system in order to keep these groups down, because generally the white majority is afraid of them, because oftentimes also in our media, these are generally speaking the people who are villainous. Two, because in radical discourse, oftentimes these people are also portrayed as the people who come in and destroy our culture, right? They're framed as dangerous, meaning that we want police to be very aggressive against these people. I think that's wrong. I think that's a point. And I think that becomes less likely at the point where we don't explicitly vote for someone who is likely to campaign on the basis of, I'm going to make things safe for you because I, as a police commissioner, have the duty to ensure your safety, your security. Note that we structurally see these kinds of things also in countries where we elect judges and where we elect DAs. Why? Because they need to present themselves as someone who will keep you safe, because the vast majority of individuals, especially those that are able to vote, actually vote according to the lines that make them feel best for themselves. Because I agree, people vote on what expresses their preferences, but given that the people who are structurally most likely to be able to vote, expressing who those people are also then matters, who is able to express their vote matters, and then therefore, because we are less likely to actually achieve the kind of structural benefits that opening government claims they want to achieve better on our side of the house, that already takes opening government out. Closing government wants to come in and say, but in their POI to Calix, they essentially allude to this kind of idea that, but a mayor is like someone who is also elected on other metrics. True, they're going to come up here and probably tell us something along the lines of, but the mayor can just shoehorn this in. Notice, however, that unlike in policing elections, the mayor has to usually take a much more liberal stance on these kinds of things because of the structurally different incentives that mayors have to run on. Mayors appearing significantly as tough on crime actually don't inherently fill this media-filled narrative that we have in our head. They also aren't primarily supposed to be tough on crime. They're primarily supposed to be people who run our society in the best, in the most structurally equitable way, right? Generally speaking, also by having more people turn out to one election, we actually become more likely to fill those preferences under our side of the house, even if it's still unfair. Proud to stand in opposition.
Two, one. Panel. In the status quo, we face a police culture that isn't just racist, but also incredibly toxically masculine, faces constant underfunding, and has no chance of challenging any form of their authority because that could cost them their job, and therefore will always look up or say what the rules dictate them and follows what they think is the norm that they should do. Hint, that is usually excess forms of violence or any form of filling into that toxic masculinity. Because there is no discourse about it, even beyond the idea of racism, there is never any chance for change. I don't believe that we can suddenly fund an entire battalion of people of color who suddenly become police officers. But I do think it is good that the general public will start questioning the practices that happen in the police and thereby stimulate reinterpretation of the laws that are that discourse itself can already create change, specifically for minorities within municipalities that are usually quite structurally oppressive towards them. Before I go into that extension, 3 points of rebuttal towards OO. The first one is that they say, oh, but we can also replace these people in a municipality kind of elections. Panel, the moment where I vote nationally, I vote on radically different things than, say, I vote in my municipality. And I think specifically the moment where people are actually quite pro, say, socialist or progressive green policies, but locally they face a lot of, say, issues of criminality, they are less likely to vote on them because that is what they experience every day. The moment where you can, say, targetedly vote on one particular issue because there's a separate election for them, you're more likely to progressively vote in other issues. I think, therefore, it is good to target these things specifically because in the municipality issues, I think that police brutality is something a lot of people of not color don't usually face. and therefore they will vote on things like economic deprivation or the housing issue. So that's why there's never change. The second thing is that they say, oh, but people of color will never be able to vote, and therefore they will never change anything. Notice that they backstab then their own mechanism on saying, oh, but we will solve it in the municipality issues, and therefore it is kind of great, because that goes anyway, right? So that means that there's no delta under the house whatsoever. The third one Lindsay will bring, because I run out of time and I have to start, the extension. Let's go to the actual nuance extension and what is likely to happen under this side of the house. I think, first of all, where this is going to happen or most impactful is neighborhoods that are fractionalized in terms of whether they have both people of color and say both privileged people and those kind of things. I think what happens then is that you give these people a choice the moment where the elections start. I think what that stimulates is at least some form of discourse about these people and what is going on. I don't think that that means that suddenly you get huge media issues, but I do think that on everything that you as a police officer did, you have to explain right now in the media the moment where you want to be elected as an officer. That means that the moment where there's a lot of corruption going on or a lot of bribery going on, and people or your fellow officer knows that you have been taking part in that, he's likely to mention those kind of things in the media because he doesn't want, or he mentioned those things to papers because he doesn't want to be elected. I think this also goes for excess forms of brutality, maybe not to people of color, but I do think to say any form that you did, I do think that say the moment where George Floyd happened, that is a horrible thing, that is huge and comes in the media. I'd rather have it that this is actually being scrutinized on a lower basis again and again so that we can see every nuanced form of it. So why do I think that that is then something that is really good? Because I do think that even though there are laws that you should hold people accountable to, laws are very interpretable. Let's say that the law in the Netherlands is that the possession of weed isn't actually legal, but selling it is. We often see it through the fingers the moment we have someone because it's the norm that you're allowed to have that. I think currently the moment where you allow police officers to be elected, the same thing here goes. That is to say, the moment where you do something that the people actually don't think should be able by you to be done, they will probably scrutinize you for it, and you will try to be a better officer, or you will try to be more nuanced on these kind of things. Or even if you don't, or at least the moment where people start talking about whether they actually agree about this, they'll do so. The reason why I think that you're likely to change your behavior is because of the way these political things work. It's not just the bubble that OG says. I think the moment where the majority vote is what gets you as an officer, you want to have the majority of the people. Regions that are often fractionalized don't ensure you the majority of the people. That means you also have to cater to the minority of the people. Maybe some people of color in your neighborhood, maybe the more poor people, maybe the people that do actually face the consequences of your behavior. I think that is incredibly good because that means that you are more nuancedly interpreting the norms and the laws that already existed that is going against the toxic culture that currently exists. I think the second thing that why this is particularly good is because usually on the issues, you're better able to justify or better able to explain to the public what is actually going wrong. I think the reason why a lot of people are currently not changing the police is because they think that George Floyd was a racial issue, even though it is an excess brutality, underfunding, and police toxic masculinity issue. The moment where you're able to break that down into smaller municipalities and show the more nuanced things in this in the media, because you have these elections more often, is the moment where you can convince the public that maybe, say, toxic masculinity is the problem in the police. I do think that a lot of people do think that that is an issue and then don't have to equate that with the same racial issue on which they have a very different opinion. That means that there's more likelihood of small and nuanced change. I think the second thing is that it actually allows officers to challenge each other. The current problem is that when you are an officer, you will always face and look up and try to adhere to the current existing hierarchy. I think that is horribly toxic because the current existing hierarchy are the people who've been longest in the police and have their highest ranks in the police, and therefore are most likely ingrained in a toxic masculinity culture that currently exists in the police. That means that you're most likely to adhere to that kind of culture in order to get a promotion. Currently, the second officer in the hierarchy can now challenge the first officer in the hierarchy by scrutinizing that same culture to the public, because I don't think that the public is evil, as OO describes, and doesn't care about any of these kind of things. That's the collectivity problem, right? I think that everybody actually thinks that you should not be toxically masculine, but if you think that the other person thinks you should, that you're still going to do it. And if everybody thinks that you have the collective action problem, I think that that is exactly the thing that you're able to challenge now. That means that you are more likely to challenge the currently existing norms towards the other officers, which are most likely to be toxic because they're higher up, which we break down now. And second, you're most likely to frame issues in such a way that the common people or the less privileged people, or the more privileged people also understand it, more likely to change those norms. Before I go on, opening.
Franca, the vast majority of people don't think of the world in terms of toxic masculinity. The vast majority of us don't have gender studies degrees. The vast majority of the people just look at police officers and expect.
Maybe they don't call it like that. Maybe they don't call it like that, you'll see. But I do think that the moment you're in the media and you say this person drew his gun and I'm actually uncomfortable being in a patrol with him all the time, a lot of people will relate. I think that is a lot easier framing than saying black person being killed by officer though he was a criminal, because that is something that's much more polarizing towards the vast majority of the public. Why is this so incredibly important? First, because it allows for a more nuanced and say more majority-based framing of an issue that is broken down into more solvable fractionalities. I do think that a small part of the problem is underfunding of the police that stimulates people to be very harsh into wanting to hire up because they don't get enough pay grades, or corruption. Those things are easier solvable than solving racism as a whole in the police, which we now allow to break down and thereby change because we change the institution from within. The second thing is that specifically for minorities in neighborhoods where the brutality happens often against them, you are better able to reduce the kind of violence, even though you can't solve the issue as a whole. I think for them that's already incredibly beneficial because at least you now have, say, the lesser toxic officer challenging the one that is more toxic by the way that he talks about it in the media, and you create that accountability on that basis. For those two reasons, I think we do also help minorities, but in general also change that institution for the better, because otherwise we will always try to reinforce the norms that already currently exist. I'm so incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for their speech. To introduce the substantive for the close.
Final 2 points of extension, 2 separate points of extension, each of them win us the debate. Firstly, there's way more crime that harm everybody, and especially the weaker people in society. And secondly, while there's less reform, less improving of the police, such as getting rid of brutal policemen or corrupt policemen. Before that, 3 points of rebuttal to CG. Their main case is there's more accountability, there's more scrutiny. That case as a whole is strongly symmetric in this debate. Why? Because their main characterization is the George Floyd style events. In these style events, the media already has a very strong incentive to blame the police, to question the police, to demand answers to the police, as we've seen with multiple high-profile police press events that they needed to justify themselves. We think that even in the softer characterization of the day-to-day mismanagement of police, media has still a strong incentive to question the police as a strong organization, as a significant organization that is present in the life of all members of society, and especially the weaker members of society. And the controversies that Franca points to are something that drives a lot of clicks. So the media still has a lot of incentive to scrutinize them to the same degree. And also, yes, Yossi is right. It's the same bubbling of one bubble every 3 or 4 years. The extent to which the public is more interested and therefore will seek out more accountability and scrutiny is not that big, and we don't get analysis on why it increases massively to the extent that CG need here to make their case not symmetric. So let's get to my substantive. More crimes and harming more people. Note the separation of interest that happened here between the municipality, the mayor, and the police commissioner that happened under the motion. Under Gov's world, the commissioner is the main actor that is blamed when more crime happens, when bad events that involve the police happens. That means that the mayor comparatively cares less about these sort of events when bad events happen. Also, the mayor gets less credit when good stuff happens, when there's a reduction in crime, when there's exceptional police work that happens sometimes. So on both sides, the mayor gains less and loses more. And also, the mayor is not elected solely by the amount of crime in the city, but also on other sorts of bad things that happen: bad education, bad infrastructure, bad medical services. These are all things that municipality needs to fix, and therefore they are much more incentivized under Gov world to budget them more comparatively. Note all the things that OG already pointed out that are other things that concern citizens. That is on the expense of dealing with crime. That means that the police gets less resources when they need them, and therefore we have more crime and less reform. Now, I get that in the progressive West, and especially in debate circles, defund the police is very popular and perceived as something very well. But this needs to happen as we get from OG at most of the world, like in most cities in the world. And we think that is very problematic because in a lot of areas of the world, there are still high crime rates. The police is very much needed and is a trusted part of society and isn't necessarily brutal and oppressive as they want you to believe. And we need that, right? There are a lot of places when there's a lot of that, and the police need a lot of money for personnel, for having people on the ground, for presence in difficult neighborhoods, to have deterrence against crimes that harm these people, to have prolonged investigation to root out base causes for that, to have non-antique equipment technology-wise, to have the ability to pursue their interests, to recruit professional people, decent people, people who will actually be good policemen, right? To have public programs to cooperate with local population, all of things that massively decrease crimes. And under Gov's role, we'll have more crime. And also, any reform needs a lot of time and money. Things like changing the way you instruct police, making them more professional, rooting out corruption, improving technology, improving equipment for having better enforcement and more targeted one. All of that happens less when the police is less funded. We also have more speeded up investigation and therefore harm less severe crimes and more innocent people. When there's a murder or a robbery or a more significant crime, the media demands answers from the police to close the case. If it doesn't happen within a week or two, they brand the commissioner a failure, something that will affect them later in life, and they need to move on, right? These means that they are incentivized to pressure policemen to close the case really fast, to pursue only the street corner dealers instead of the heads of their organization, to find some unfortunately black guy who was in the neighborhood and to pin it on them. That's bad because there's, first of all, way more crime. And also, since crime tends to harm the weakest, tend to harm the poorest, tend to harm the people who are more next to that, to fall into this vicious cycle, these are to the school to prison pipeline, these are the people who will harm most in this debate. Let's take closing.
So when an issue that I otherwise don't care about because I don't face it happens to be in the media twice a year instead of once a year, do I care more or less about it?
That sounds symmetrical. Like if it happens twice, I don't know why you happen more. Like if the media, but we claim that the media still is scrutinized to the same degree. So it's not the difference between 1 and 2, it's the difference between like 100 and 101. We think that's mostly symmetrical. Let's talk about why we have less that I talked about, because this motion lends a huge amount of power to police unions, the bodies to dictate the police commissioner's policy. And these are bodies that are mandated, that their power comes from maintaining presence of police to maintain people within the force, even if they're corrupt, even if they're brutal. And if the commissioner wants to kick these people off, the union will stand against him. Now, a demonstration of policemen against a police commissioner is political death, right? They will frame him as ineffective against crime and risking the community. They will be perceived as insiders and therefore knowing more. That's the person who loses the base. They will sway the electorate to a much higher degree. The police commissioner then cannot fire brutal policemen, cannot fire corrupt policemen, which makes it more entrenched. It also means that they switch around more because, again, police are determined by how badly they perform, not how well they perform, because that's something that you only notice when it's not working well, which means they're likely to be switched out any 3 or 4 years. That means that the long-term perspective for all these reforms that I mentioned simply doesn't happen. The person who is signed on them is switched every 3 or 4 years to another person, therefore the reform cannot carry on and isn't effective. The impact of that is police brutality happens more, corruption happens more, racism in police forces is more entrenched and is more difficult to root out in the comparative. When police are oversighted by their municipalities, bodies that are less strong-armed by unions and are switched out less often, and therefore are more able to crack down on corruption and brutality in the police force. And we think on the comparative, that's way better.
I'd like to thank the people.
2, 1. Panel, I'm going to start off with two incredibly important pieces of framing that make sure that Franca's extension is well understood, but also takes down a massive part of the opposition case already. Then I'll take down closing opposition explicitly, then opening opposition, and lastly, do the weighing against opening government. Pieces of framing first. The kind of scrutiny that Franca talks to you about is different from the scrutiny in the status quo, because the scrutiny Gil talks about is happening at the moment that George Floyd is murdered. We prefer the scrutiny to take place before Black guys are being murdered rather than afterwards. That is what happens at the moment that you are going to have the kind of discussions. We don't believe that specifically at the moment that nothing is going on, media has incentives actually to care about the police, specifically not on a local scale, because these are not the headlines that actually sell. They are smaller things that smaller groups of people actually care about happening on a local level, not something the media is significantly going to care about. Second piece of framing on the whole issue of security that we get all throughout the entire opposition bench. Panel, please accept the fact that security also means Black guys not being arrested without any kind of reason. It means not getting a gun pointed at you. That is the kind of security the police also needs to cater to and can profile themselves against, specifically in more fractured communities where Franca explains to you that it's the case that people have incentives to care towards the minority, specifically given the fact that the majority is never guaranteed when you have a larger minority in an area as well, and you need to cater to them. That means that a lot of the incentives as to how you are going to want to be perceived as being tough on crime or perceived as creating a lot of security doesn't necessarily stand to the extent that you need to cater to these groups. We say uniquely these communities are most important here. Why? Because these are the issues in which the communities in which minorities most often actually face the kind of discrimination, face the police brutality that we are talking about, because it's far easier for people to actually blame them because there is more of an interaction between the different groups and elite. We think that that is something that's incredibly important and already takes down a lot of the framing in what we get from both opposition teams. So let me run through their cases quickly, starting with closing opposition. So I think closing opposition firstly brings you the point of how the resources for the police are actually going to decrease and why that is something that is problematic. A couple of responses to that. One, this is not entirely in line with the opening opposition case. At the moment that opening opposition wants to say how it's the case that the police commissioner is going to be so much stronger than the mayor in general, I think it's odd to then suddenly argue in CO that the mayor is going to be much stronger. I'm unsure what it is. Presumably it's going to be somewhat balanced, but the mayor can still, or the police commissioner can say, hey, look, people want money for this. They have voted me on the platform of actually making sure that there's psychological help for people in trouble. Give me money for that. That is also a mandate that opening opposition wants to talk about that we can then have on our side of the house. But thirdly, I say in the status quo, there is already a massive pressure to actually decrease the amount of funding for the police, right? Opposition has never proven what a significant delta of their kind of influence is going to be and how significantly resources are going to decrease under the comparative, right? We say that this is also something that is important because what ultimately matters is not necessarily the amount of resources that you have, but rather the way in which you implement them and how you assign those. And here is where Franca's case comes into place, because Franca uniquely argues that it's not always necessarily going to be the fact that policy changes, but rather that a significant amount of policies depends on the kind of implementation that you have in the local area, and that you can only do that at the moment that there is awareness of these kind of policies and how that is actually getting influence, right? You need to have a specific kind of trust and understanding with the police then as well, which we create at the moment that you do understand them better to make sure that it is easier to solve crime as well. So when it comes down to getting more crime, we say, well, listen, a reason why it's very hard to arrest criminals and why we do still have more crime is because whole communities don't necessarily trust the police because of the fact that they are often being ratted out, and in that sense they don't give up their loved ones or other people in their community to the police. Under our side of the house, where we create more trust and more understanding of the police, and we get an ability to explain your ideas, that is the point at which you are actually going to create less crime. But that also takes on the entire point about how there's going to be less reform, right? Because we say that ultimately, and we think also that point is so at some points quite similar to OO, so I'll take them down simultaneously. But we think that it's often not the case that just the whole security issue in and of itself is enough to sway people. Why not? Because one, as Franca said in her extension, it is the case that at the moment that you have a fractured community, you need to cater towards the security of the minority specifically, and not just towards the security of the elite, right? Specifically on the comparative though, the idea is that people from the elite, i.e. being mayors or whatever, are going to be the ones electing the police commissioner. No one on the opposition has explained why they don't have similar biases with regards to how it's actually the case that you want someone to be tough on crime. Specifically having to cater to these minorities is something that makes you consider more what security actually means and the kind of groups that people are catering to. We think that that is crucial at the moment that it comes down to taking biases, specifically given the fact that the whole opposition case apparently depends on the situation in Germany and Israel, where you actually elect your mayors in the first place. We don't do that in the Netherlands. We don't elect police officers at all. We say that here it is even more the toxic kind of masculinity that you are facing. Why then is it the case that we can get these kind of changes under our side of the house? Franca explains in her extensions how elections are a unique mechanism through which you can frame your messages in a way in which it actually makes sure that you do accept people reach them in a message that works for them. Before I move on that, Joseph, go ahead.
Unlike police officers, mayors need to respond to social backlash because they maintain an image of standing for all. Police commissioners can always cater towards the care of dangerous looters rhetoric because they're supposed to create law and order, unlike mayors.
Yes, and they are also supposed to create law and order for these minorities specifically, for which at a majority, when you're voting on a larger scale, you are less likely to actually care for them in the first place, right? So we say, panel, given that the police actually has incentives to make sure that specifically in the communities that matter most, you actually cater to the minorities and make sure that they have an ability to vote and that you protect them as well, it is likely that the way in which you are going to frame your policies and the way in which you are going to interact with them is more beneficial towards the minorities. That means we don't have the burden of creating massive police reform under our side of the house because the minor things can already make a change. Why does this also beat out opening government? Because opening government case never explained how it's going to be the case that you can have the epistemic access to your preferences related to the kind of police reforms and policies at all. We have explained how specifically that is filled in and how you can now see your preferences and the way in which they can actually be influenced, even if opening opposition is right and we will not create policy change. The way in which we deal with policy changes, we get more scrutiny before George Floyd happens. I think that's the most important part in this debate. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the
Look, this debate is about how do you make these decisions better. We explained to you that once you separate between the people who hold the budget and the people who hold the police, this just creates more crime, which is the biggest impact in this debate. Therefore, only on this we should win, but we still also win on where do we make better decisions, because we are not dependent on any specific characterization. We just explain why the incentives are just going to get worse on government side. I'm going to have three questions. First of all, where do you have more crime? Secondly, where is there more harm to minorities specifically? Lastly, where are the decisions of commissioners better? Before that, like one big point of experience rebuttal to CG, basically they say, well, people vote in municipal elections by what they care about, while minorities vote about like policing and stuff like that. And therefore, a lot of stuff, police brutality is going to get lower. So even if they are right, we don't care, because you still need to prioritize budget to the police. This means police brutality gets worse on their side when they don't control the budget, because even in their best case, without answering our case, they're going to lose. Why? Because we proved to you that there's going to be more violence, even in the best case where the police is good. Why? Because police have worse equipment, they have less funding, they have less staff. This just means that they are much more overworked. Even when they are good, they are going to be much more horrible and do police brutality. But think about the cases they describe where there's already police brutality, it's going to get so much worse. Secondly, don't think that only minorities care about policing, right? Even if you live in a rich neighborhood, it's not that you have a wall around your neighborhood, right? People can still come from other neighborhoods and do crime in your area. If you go to protest, then the police can still do police brutality against you. We honestly think that in a lot of situations, richer people are going to want to stop police brutality as well. But if a lack of trust in the police is what creates crime, then the mayor is going to know about this, right? Especially in the Western countries where they talk about defunding the police and stuff like that, like CG described. But even if when you defund the police, there's a difference between giving the police forces gradually less and less budget, because as a mayor, it's not beneficial for you, compared to doing reforms in the police, which always, even if we want to defund them, cost more money, right? Because when you fire a lot of people, you need to give them a lot of compensation. This is a lot of money. Because when you want to replace the equipment or the training the police officers give, this takes a lot of money as well. So even when you want to defund the police nicely, they're less able to do so. Lastly, they say that there is a contradiction from opening. Honestly, there is one person that controls the budget. There is another person that controls the police. It's not a matter of power, but a matter of who makes the decision. Let's talk about where do we have more crime. So opening government say, well, the mayor has other stuff that you want to invest in and prioritize. Exactly, that's our case. That's what explains that mayors have no incentive now to give budget to these police forces. This means they're going to get so much less equipment and stuff like that. This means because the police budget takes a lot of money, because you have a lot of staff, a lot of equipment, a lot of resources, then they're just going to get so much less of this. Now, this wins us the debate. Why? Because even if opening opposition are right about harming minorities, we just prove a bigger impact. Why? First of all, there are really lousy cities in the world, right? When we're talking about Brazil, India, South Africa, places where you have lots and lots of crime, then our case just wins in all of these situations where you are going to have more crime. Secondly, note, our case just affects more people, right? Not only that we protect minorities who are affected by crime, we protect majority people who are affected by crime, specifically in the neighborhoods where you have the most crime. So we also protect the most important places in the debate. At this point, we just protect the majority of the people. This is the biggest impact in this debate. We should win. Secondly, where is there more harm to minorities? So when opening opposition say, well, there's going to be a policy of tough on crime. This is very dependent on the characterization of how police commissioners are going to be from a specific policy or another. We agree with this to some extent, but their main explanation is that minorities are going to vote less in these sorts of elections. We agree in a lot of situations. We think that there are situations where it's important enough for them, and therefore they are going to continue to vote. We prove a case which isn't dependent on this. Even in the cases where they can't vote or do vote, we still win. Why? Because we explain in a much likelier reason why police unions always want to be tough on crime, because that's the most beneficial for them. That's what protects their lives. Why they have a lot of power over the elections, because they are a big body that has a lot of budget, that has a lot of members. And note, they're the people that care most about police policy. Therefore, they're mostly going to get involved and do lobbyism when we're talking about elections for police. Therefore, we have more harms to minorities under our case than opening oppositions. Why? Because they are going to act swiftly, because they need to react to the media and stuff like that. This wins the best case in CG, right? Even if you want to act swiftly, you are going to harm minorities because you are not going to find the actual perpetrator. Secondly, this just creates police officers who are more racist, right? Each and every interaction becomes worse and worse because there's a difference between changing the directive of police forces and giving them less equipment. So they need to be more and more violent because they are scared of malfunction in their equipment, or they have less partners and less people to patrol. Therefore, they can do less prevention. So even in the best case of government, there's going to be less police policy, and therefore our case applies in more situations. Opening.
Your stab on funding aside, ops can't claim both mayors being less tough on crime, but also accountable. They presume people want tough on crime and then need mayors to listen to people for mitigation, meaning you either get harsh crime policy too, or less accountability because mayors don't listen.
No. We don't necessarily say they're going to be tough on crime or less. We just say they have less incentive to invest in police forces. Money is what drives how well our police in real life. This is enough for us to win this debate. So at this point, we have already beaten opening opposition. Where are decisions of commissioners better? So OG have this legitimacy case, right? People listen to, commissioners listen to more people. First of all, there are many other methods to do this, right? You can make them have how do you say it, parties with the press and stuff like that to make sure that they answer questions. You can have a public complaint officer whose whole job is to take complaints from people and translate them into police policy. Secondly, note, democratic representatives is something that exists, right? When you choose for the mayor or you choose for the parliament, you always choose someone to represent you, and then they can prioritize. Specifically, this is really important because you have to have a central person who has the ability to prioritize between different policies when you want to invest more in education, when you want to invest more in the police. So this is more democratic on our side when you have the ability to prioritize them.